morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. I'm based in London. It's just past 1 a.m. here, but I'm super happy to be doing this and just to be able to talk a little bit about the embeddable web on Android. My name is Peter. I'm a software engineer and a manager on the Chrome and Android teams, where I particularly look after the mobile web install team, as well as the embeddable web on Android team, and then with a focus on developer interaction. So the platforms that we have there, and then the APIs that we expose towards those platforms. One of the things that we spoke about last time during BlinkOn is that we all think, yes, we all think of the web as being primarily accessed through browsers. This definitely is true conventionally on desktops, but even back like in Windows 98, there was active desktop, and nowadays on other platforms, the web is kind of like in our mental model, it's primarily the browser, but it's actually in quite a lot of places. So to recap one of the metrics that I shared last BlinkOn, on Android specifically, about half of the time spent on the web by users is within the browser. So the metrics that I'm showing here and that I'm basing this on is purely based on Chrome, because these are the platforms that we can measure and actually have metrics for. This might be slightly different for other browsers, but the gist of this is that the combination of Chrome together with Chrome custom tabs, which is a way for applications to embed web content within their applications, as well as WebView. Together make up like the full pie, obviously, but Chrome is only half of this pie. And that's actually far less than at least I was considering when we started on this journey of bringing the web more comprehensively towards Android. So we think of the different ways of embedding the web within an application as embeddable services. We have 5 of these platforms primarily. The first one is WebView. You're probably aware of this. WebView is one of the oldest Android APIs, introduced in the first version of Android, and it kind of shows. The API is really old. It's full of kind of detailed, very low-level interactions that you wouldn't expect in any sort of API exposed by a browser nowadays. And it also means that we're kind of set in what we can do with the platform. The APIs are there, and any sort of change will immediately propagate to literally millions of Android applications. And that makes it really difficult to make changes. Chrome custom tabs in general is a platform. We are aware of 8 implementations of custom tabs, and that's absolutely fantastic to see. Users pick a default browser on their devices, and regardless what that default browser is, it's fantastic that if you then use an application, say Twitter, that has a primary use case but might want to refer out to web content outside of that use case, that it actually uses your default browser to make sure that all your state, all your information is there. But importantly, that also it just works the way you're expected from your browser. In terms of installability, we have 2 primary APIs. We have Trusted Web Activities, which is installability based on custom tabs, particularly for the use case of being published in stores. In our case, that would be the Play Store. And then we have Web APKs, which is a technology that Chrome supports for enabling more organic installation of PWAs, particularly that discovered through the browser, through normal browsing through the web. Within Chrome, you can access this through the menu, and there will be an install button for PWAs who enable this and meet the quality guidelines. And Chrome will also give suggestions about the ability to install applications when you're visiting them and have a certain level of engagement. And then finally, we have WebLayer. This is a platform that last BlinkOn we spent some time talking about. I won't go into too much detail about this time. We have some time for Q&A at the end, particularly because there's not a lot of updates to be shared at this point. So part of all these different platforms is that they all have slightly different properties. Some share state with the browser, others do not, and that has benefits, that has downsides. Most are compatible with the web platform, others are not. They are more dated. That depends a lot on why you might want to use a certain service. Some give you a lot of flexibility as the Android application that embeds the web platform to customize the experience, to maybe inject JavaScript or completely take over pages, where others specifically don't want you to do that because you probably should be messing with third-party content. And not all these APIs should be considered stable either. So where I just mentioned WebView as having been around since Android 1, Web Player is something that's still highly experimental and that absolutely should not be relied upon at this point. And which one you use is kind of depending on what your use case is. So these are some quotes from our reference documentation. It's a page on dev.web. The gist of it, WebView shouldn't be used for anything that's third-party content, which is out of your control. Custom tabs is great for third-party content because it's just a browser, cookies and state are shared. But actually, it's a really complicated matrix. And what you actually want to do depends quite a lot on what your use case is, and more importantly, the specifics of your use case, because it's kind of easy to talk about social as a single thing, right? So for this talk, there are 3 things that I'd like to do. So there's a couple of things that I'd like to share about just generally new functionality across these platforms, things that we've introduced since the last BlinkOn. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about plans to identify use cases and fully support them to make sure that these platforms actually meet the use cases that embedded applications present to us while maintaining the properties of the web. And then finally, we should have some time for Q&A, just general discussion about the situation of the embeddable web on Android, because I'll be the first to admit that it's quite a mess. And it's an area that we're actively investing in to do better at. So starting with WebView, the main release is the main update is that Android X WebKit, and Android X is the new name for the Android support library. Version 1.4 has been released. It has a couple, like a bug fix, an API method has been renamed in order to be a better inclusive name, which is something that we care about a lot. But one difference, one new feature that I want to highlight is something that I'm quite excited about. It's quite easy to forget or just not to realize how frequently WebView is actually being used on devices in your normal usage. It's anything from advertisements to full app content of a whole class of applications. And one of the things that's new that you can try out today is that if you install the WebView beta from the Play Store, you'll get an application in your app list that's called WebView DevTools. And that has received a new function where you can enable a flag called highlight all web views. And it adds a little bit of a yellow haze over the web views that are being shown on the device. And at least for me, it made it far easier to really reason about how frequent WebView usage actually is and how many services in completely arbitrary applications are actually based on WebView and thereby web content, which I just didn't realize at all. And it's quite a cool thing to enable on your phone for a couple of days if you use an Android device to just see what sort of adoption WebView enjoys. Custom tabs 1.3, another Android X library has been released. Better support color schemes such as dark mode, which is something that's more prevalent on mobile devices and is also coming to desktop. Ability to set screen orientation when launching a trusted web activity. This is quite important if, for example, you want to create a game. Quite frequently, a game on your phone, normally you'll hold it in portrait mode, but many games are landscape mode. And that's now something that you can set from the get-go while launching the application, which is a far better experience than actually waiting for the phone to rotate later on in the launching process. And more control over sharing behavior, which continues to be one of the superpowers of the web. Now, the image that I'm including here is actually from a prototype that we created yesterday. So it's quite new from the press. It's something that I'm really excited about. Conventionally, custom tabs are basically full screen activities that completely take you away from the application that you're in while still being branded to give you the feeling that you're still part of that application. So for example, if you open a custom tab from Twitter, there would be a back button to bring you back to Twitter. They could customize the header bar, which is great to keep feeling like you're part, like you're within Twitter. But what this experiment is showing, something that we're working on, is perhaps a custom tab doesn't have to be completely full screen. Perhaps it should be resizable, that for different use cases that you could combine web content with native content that you're using on Android without having to rely on WebView, which is currently the only way of doing that. So this again is still super new. It's something that we hope to start experimenting with later this year. Installability. So the main two changes that I'll point out are in product help and the rich install API that Kanuko already mentioned in the keynote just now. I won't say too much about that. My colleague Mustafa will have a chat on Thursday to talk about these changes in more detail, but particularly what motivates them, why they have been changed, and what research led to those changes. The final thing that I'd like to flag for Web APK specifically. So I mentioned that Web APKs are the organic way of installing an app that's enabled by the browser itself. Historically, all our Web APK servers have been in the United States, which is quite easy when that's where your audience is. But quite a lot of websites actually differentiate the content that's being served to users based on the demographic that they're in. And by all the servers being in a single location, that makes it really difficult for a site, for example, an e-commerce site, to offer a different experience for people in, for example, India versus Europe versus the United States. One of the changes that the team has been working on is that we now have a number of Web APK servers within Europe as well, and we hope to be able to roll this out to other demographics as well, just to make sure that users really get the APKs, the websites that they're requesting, not just in terms of the browsing behavior, but also in the appearance and the behavior of the app as it's being installed. So getting back a little bit to the quote that I mentioned earlier on, use cases. Use cases are difficult for embedding the web within another application because there's an endless stream of reasons why you might want to do that. So the main thing that we're focusing on right now is that for quite a lot of years, we've been sharing best practices. All our documentation says don't use WebView for third party. It all says if you want access to the DOM or anything like that, use this, use that. It's all focused on what we want people to do as opposed to what people are actually doing. And we actually know of quite a lot of use cases where the app wants to do the right thing. They want to use a particular technology, but there's this teeny tiny detail within their use case that, for example, means that custom tabs isn't the right solution for them because it would completely destroy the user journey and the flows that their app enables. This is where we're currently at. We want to create a far more comprehensive understanding of looking at the entire space of Android applications. What is currently going on? What are apps currently using the web platforms, the embedded areas for? But also, what sort of web content is being loaded in those environments, and what sort of assumptions are they making? Are they relying on proprietary APIs that might be added to WebView users? And just generally questions like that. The main outcome of this is that hopefully within a couple of months, we'll start publishing more effective guidelines on what the most appropriate embeddable platform would be for a set of use cases. But then rather based on just what we think would be best to use, also look at what's currently happening. Now, what that actually enables us to do is that we want to make sure that the platforms that we offer, so we know that there are differences between WebView, custom tabs, the installability, functionality platforms, and so on, that the APIs that we offer actually completely and comprehensively address the use cases that developers want to provide within their applications. And this is quite an important thing to do, and that's kind of referring back to what I just mentioned. We don't want to say that we support social. We want to make sure that we don't stand in the way of actual applications to innovate as they see fit, without sacrificing user information or control on the other end of the coin either. So one of the examples here is that a practice that has been employed by Chromium-based browsers through origin trials quite effectively is experimentation. This is something that really doesn't exist on those platforms. Releasing something in Android X could easily take 3, 4, 5 months just to get the API out there. And only at that point, a developer might start being enabled to experiment with APIs, figure out what that is. And then you're looking at 6 months to a year of a feedback cycle with very little possibilities of actually changing course. On top of that, the processes for getting these APIs out there are completely opaque. And that's something we want to make transparent as well and figure out how we can enable experimentation just to make sure that we can actually respond to feedback. And that brings me to the third thing. Right now, we don't really get any feedback about these platforms. And one of the things that we're very envious of origin trials, for example, is that you can put something out there and you actually get active feedback, active discussion from developers back there. On the web, the bar of doing this is quite low. There's a fair number of users on Chrome beta, for example, out there for web developers to try out new features, if that's necessary at all. The number of people who use a non-stable version of WebView on their device is much, much, much lower. That's just not feasible at all to run experiments on, and that impact that affects our ability to make changes, to introduce new features, but also to have confidence in the features that we implement, while not really having a feedback loop with developers. Now, what we're going to do there is to create a more active funnel. So borrowing a great idea from the Fugu team is that we'd like to start setting up a community sync. There are quite a lot of other browsers on Android. I already mentioned we're aware of like at least 8 other custom tabs implementations out there, which is absolutely fantastic. So following the Fugu community sync, one of the things that we'll be doing is setting up more like probably a monthly or periodically meeting to just give updates. We want to share what we're working on. We'd love for others to share what they're working on, to just make sure that when anyone wants to introduce a new feature in custom tabs, for example, that other browsers know that this is going to happen, can follow up, but also have the ability to provide feedback before this actually happens. And that's one of the properties that we haven't yet been able to enable with this platform. Secondly, borrowing from Bubble Wrap, which is a more higher level library that we publish to create TWAs, which is available on GitHub to make sure that you can publish your PWA in the Play Store, is to set up developer office hours. Now, what's happening with the Bubble Wrap meetings is they happen once per month for an hour, and quite frequently just like completely random developers join with questions, with ideas, with suggestions, with feedback about functionality that we're introducing. And creating that sort of interaction is also something that we want to experiment with and just learn about, is this worth doing? And we're hoping to be able to get to that in June. So that's a very high level update roughly of where we are. We have a bunch of minutes left, and I'd love to hear your ideas and input, or just generally answer questions about embeddable web on Android. Thank you.
Cool. So fantastic talk. Really helps to demystify a lot of things I've been wondering about in terms of WebView and WebLayer. So I had a question about the support matrix of Android versions that we have to care about with WebView. So I think the oldest one that I know that Google still look at is Android L. I'm wondering if there are any other wondering if there are any other old Android versions that we should be looking at when making changes that might impact WebView.
No, not directly. So the general idea is that until Android ICS, Ice Cream Sandwich, WebView was based on the Android browser, so its own fork of WebKit. As you mentioned, starting with Android L, WebView I think it was K, where WebView actually was based on Chromium, and then starting L, it started becoming updatable through the Play Store. And those update rates are fairly good. They're quite in line with Chromium. So that's far better aligned with just what you expect from the browser in general to have the latest functionality. Now, the main thing to care about here are 2 other categories, which are non-GMS core, so non-Google Play Services devices, so browsers that don't ship with Chrome specifically, because they won't be receiving those updates by default. And this is particularly important if you also target, for example, Asian countries, where such devices are far more common, because those users generally have a version of WebView that is delivered with the device when they purchase it, that won't be updated for the lifetime of the device. So I think, as with many things, look at your metrics.
Okay, so just to loop back slightly on the question, so every Android version from L is currently still supported for WebView at the moment.
Yes.
Okay. I'll go back on mute.
So I have a question about, thanks for the talk, about a few slides back when you mentioned like transitioning from kind of prescriptively telling app developers what to do to starting to think about WebView feature development that matches kind of developers, existing patterns. That totally makes sense, like in the abstract, but I'm having a little, bit of a hard time, like matching that to like, feature development. Partly because I'm just not really familiar with like the WebView technical roadmap. Could you give like an example of kind of how that's influenced feature development?
I'll be very honest. I don't have the concrete answer there yet. In general, what we're doing right now, and what even with the preliminary data that we have right now, is that what our best practices say just doesn't match what developers are actually doing. And that's not a good situation to come from. And that's definitely something to address. So identifying where we are today is step one. Going forward, so we'll definitely continue to be opinionated about what the best way forward is. Chrome, Google, Android, we all very deeply care about the web, and as do many other platforms and companies. And this is an area in which we have a good understanding generally of what the most appropriate experience for a particular user journey would be. And the challenge of that, particularly in regards to, for example, making sure that if you visit a particular website where you log in, for example, to make a financial transaction, that you make sure that there's no man in the middle or anything like that. What that will look like in practice, I don't know yet. I want to understand where we stand today and then iterate from there. Because if we introduce new features that don't address like the sort of tiny bits of the use cases, and there's countless of examples to mention there. For example, an app that embeds the web using WebView because it needs access to the DOM in order to pick a high quality image. That's the sort of thing that pretty much the entire flow could be done in a custom tab, but has to be done in a WebView because there's no access to the DOM within a custom tab, even though it's third-party content. And then we can say, yeah, you should be using custom tabs, but it just doesn't work. And that's an area in which we really need both metrics, but also feedback from both vendors and developers to understand what we need.
Makes sense. Thanks.
Thank you, Robert. Let me have a look. Michael's question is, why does the location of the web APK server affect localization or which site gets installed? IP-based geolocation of where the request comes from. And if all the servers are in the US, then all the IP addresses are in the US, and that might affect the actual manifest, for example, that's being served. Cool. Thank you so much. If there are no further questions, then yeah, let's end here. My email address is on the screen. I also have Twitter, or like you can find me on Slack. So if you've got any additional questions or ideas, please let me know. Thank you so much.